There's a lot going on right now at the South Carolina State House, from paying teachers more to tackling the budget. I talk one-on-one with State Representative Spencer Wetmore of House District 115 for this edition of Quintin's Close-Ups. And if you haven't already, subscribe to my YouTube channel and like Quintin's Close-Ups on Facebook. State Representative Spencer Wetmore, welcome back to Quintin's Close-Ups.
Thank you so much for having me.
You're welcome. You know, I bombarded your office a couple of weeks ago when I had a tooth extraction and I was moving and all this other stuff. And I just needed somebody to talk to, you know.
Well, I was glad you stopped by. Y'all can come see me anytime.
I will do my best. But obviously, you know, you're an attorney, but you also are a state representative for House District 115, which I believe covers now Kiowa Island, Folly Beach, Goat Island, and parts of James Island.
And we've got Johns Island and Seabrook. So
Seabrook,
we're really, yeah. I think you're right. I think you're about right.
Okay. No worries. I know that there's so much going on at the South Carolina State House right now, you know, from the budget to now, obviously, the issue with the lethal injection drugs. Let me jump right into that, because if the South Carolina House approves this shield law for lethal injection drugs, and this is coming from WOLOTV in Columbia, the House has approved a measure that would allow any company that sells the drugs used in the process to remain secret, as well as the members of the execution team, that is. South Carolina's legal injection drugs expired in 2013, and they could not find a pharmacy willing to sell them more. And in 2021, a law was passed that allowed death row inmates to choose either the electric chair or a firing squad. And I know at this time, South Carolina has three methods of executing convicted inmates, including firing squad and the electric chair, which are both on hold pending a court review of their legality. So let me ask you this, State Representative, how will the state then lessen the wait time on death row?
You know, I think a lot of the wait time has to do with a defendant's due process rights. You know, when somebody is convicted and sentenced to the death penalty, you know, obviously the courts want to make sure that we're giving somebody as much due process as possible. So a lot of that wait time is actually the defendant's due process rights rather than the state's. You know, currently right now it is about the states and the execution methods, but a lot of it also has to do with the defendant's due process rights. You know, and you may be about to ask me about this, but I actually opposed that bill. One of my big concerns about the death penalty is the potential for a botched execution. I've always been concerned about this. You know, our constitutional standard for punishment is cruel and unusual punishment. And so as a country, as a nation, we actually track the number of botched executions by type to try to determine what constitutes cruel and unusual punishment. You know, every year we have a number of botched executions throughout the country. In fact, the firing squad is actually the least botched type of execution, but there are botched lethal injections. And so by shielding both the companies and the executioners, my concern is the inability to monitor for botched executions, the inability to review that, the inability for lawyers and defendants to have their due process, or for us even as a nation to look at it constitutionally. And so really, that's my opposition on that bill.
And so here in South Carolina, State Representative, how many botched injections have been taking place?
Well, as you mentioned, we haven't had a lethal injection since at least 2013. In fact, I think it was even sometime before that. Our records are not great historically in terms of this, so I actually can't really answer that question. Although I am delighted to say that I'm not aware of a botched execution in recent years. But again, we haven't had the lethal injection for a decade now, and so to answer your specific question, I don't know, historically what that answer would be.
So, what is the state's plan for, obviously, God forbid, a botched injection?
Right. Well, I mean, I don't know if there really is a plan. I know that medically there are procedures. There is a doctor present, but part of the issue is that with the lethal injection, I don't want to get too gory or into the details here, but part of the issue is that one of the paralysis chemicals, or at least as I understand it, one of the chemicals that's sort of help that's goes towards paralysis actually takes effect first. And so again, I'm not a medical professional, and I know that there is a doctor present, so I don't want to speak to the Department of Corrections protocols or not. But obviously, this is just something that I feel like is, somebody's life or death is just of too much importance to shield, from constitutional review.
Now, South Carolina has not been able to. And what is that review going to look like right now after this?
Well, it just means that we won't have access, either as legislators or outside legal groups who would try to, piece together statistics and data. They won't have access to, what drugs were used, what combination of drugs, the exact either staff involved or the process involved. It will all be shielded. In fact, I believe even the autopsy report. So it really does remove some meaningful review. Now, obviously, as a state, the death penalty is the law, and these are legal sentences that were given out by a jury. And so, we have to follow the law. And I think once this will be one option now that it's passed the House and Senate. And then, of course, the firing squad actually, as I mentioned earlier, if we're going to have the death penalty, it has the fewest number of botched cases. So I'll be carefully, watching the Supreme Court's ruling on that as well.
And what else do you believe will be shielded because of this new law?
You mean in other things in general, or
yes,
what does this open the door to?
Yeah.
That was a big thing that we brought up, and a lot of my colleagues brought up, both in the Judiciary Committee and on the floor, is what we talk all day long about transparency. What else are we going to start shielding now? I don't know the answer to that. It's hard to, obviously I can't predict, but it's a concern. Once you start shielding one thing, and this isn't shielding because of the state wants it. This is shielding because the big pharmacy companies want it, right? Because they don't want, their everyday drugs to be associated with, they don't want their company, Johnson and Johnson, for example. I don't know if they're one of the companies that will bid, but they don't want like people to associate, Band-Aids and everyday medicines that you give for your kids with that, with that product as well. So it makes me nervous for sure. I don't like the precedent, but of course there are things already under FOIA that we do allow, ongoing criminal investigations. There are already a number of things, either under FOIA or under other law that we do provide some protections for. So I will say that hopefully we'll take it on a case by case basis.
And I know South Carolina has not been able to get the drugs necessary for lethal injections since its batch expired a decade ago. So how much batch did the state actually have before it actually expired?
That's a great question. I do not know the answer to that. Obviously we have very few people on death row, so I can't imagine that we have, I can't imagine we have a huge stockpile of it, but I actually don't know the answer to that.
So what drugs would actually be necessary right now?
Well, it's a chemical, it's a combination of drugs that are used, and I won't pretend to be an expert on it, but I do know that it's a combination of drugs that are used that in conjunction go towards the heart, and there's supposed to be a sort of pain piece, and then in fact the one that stops the heart. So I won't pretend to be an expert on the specifics of it, and in fact I'm not sure how much your listeners want to hear about all that.
Yeah. And I know, too, that businesses have refrained from providing the drugs due to the backlash, fears of boycotting, as you just mentioned. So how many of these businesses potentially are in your district?
Oh, I don't know. I'm not aware of many pharmaceutical companies in my district. There may be some that I'm just not aware of. I know that we have a couple of pharmaceutical companies in South Carolina. I don't know whether or not these companies would provide those types of drugs. I don't know. Again, I guess that's the idea behind the shield, is that they don't want their company names associated with it. So I guess, if the law works as intended, even I don't know.
Yes, ma'am. And how will the state keep the identity of prison officials who help carry out an execution that is confidential from any form of public disclosure? There are some privacy things now. I guess they'll just handle it like they handle, personnel matters. In fact, currently, so for example, when there's a firing squad, I believe my understanding is that 2 of the officers have blanks
and only one is actually firing. So, we have things like that in place already. And I think that's more to protect our officers, because obviously that's got to be a very difficult job to carry out that sort of a sentence. And so, but they'll handle it the same way they would handle, any other confidential personnel matter. And obviously there are already a lot of sensitivities built in around execution. So I don't think it will be hard for I think our agencies are used to having to handle, confidential, everything from, tax records and business license receipts and things like that to, to this sort of thing. So they have ways of handling and making sure that information stays protected.
And what else should stay protected in your mind?
Oh gosh. Well, I come from local government, and so, I definitely think that, I think people are maybe surprised, or maybe not if you've had to deal with the state or the local governments. But there is a lot of information that has to go to our local governments, right? Everything from, when you pay your business license, you have to report the gross receipts for that year, right? So that's, potentially a really big piece of information to have to report. And so I think South Carolina has always said it's a business friendly state. And I think it's important that, if we're going to attract these kinds of, major businesses and investments in our state that provide good jobs for South Carolinians, I think it's, I do think that some limited protections, especially things that are, if you're not using public money and you're not using public funds or resources or real estate, I think, certainly I think a business has a right to remain a private business, only to the extent that they're not, using public land or money or things like that.
So how many businesses in your district are actually doing that right now?
Are you? Oh gosh. Well, we had the PPP program, and so I do think that there were a lot of businesses but those are disclosed, so you can go online right now and identify which businesses in your district or your zip code or by name, received PPP loans, how those funds were used, and so certainly there would be a huge number there. We have everything from, gosh, out at Folly Beach, we have businesses that rent chairs on the beach, right? So they have to disclose a certain, they have to disclose things, right? So it spans the gamut, right? We have, school districts that report, and we have, public-private partnerships that do housing construction projects, right? So it really spans the gamut. I don't know that I could really guess how many there are, but it's definitely wide-ranging in terms of, and I think public-private partnerships are a good thing, right? Anytime you can sort of use either an incentive or something to leverage private investment, that's less money, that we have to spend to create a really good outcome. So I always try to support that.
Sure. And I know, okay, then State Representative, so what private partnerships are available right now for, say, affordable housing in District 115?
Well, I'll be honest with you. That's one of the things I think so District 115 is not exactly known to be a mecca of affordable housing and affordability. In fact, it's one of the highest median income districts in the state. And I certainly, I don't know that, setting aside Keough and Seabrook, which are private communities that don't pay property taxes and all of that, I'll set them aside. That's been an issue on Folly, on James Island. I've got, a mom came to me just the other day saying her rent was going up again. What could we do? There are several it's really a local issue, although the state has created a number of both tax credits and incentives, and I'll talk about those in a second. But the city of Charleston does a really good job with their affordable housing program. Now, whether or not there are units going in on James Island, I don't know. But frankly, the goal for me, I think, and this, but for your viewers who may not be familiar with my background, I'm a land use attorney by trade, so I think about zoning a lot. For me, the key is to have the housing close to the jobs, right? So if a lot of people are working downtown, you want the housing units to be either within walking, biking, or public transit distance of these commercial centers. So frankly, I don't know that a lot of my area of James Island is, would be considered sort of a commercial center or a job center. So for that reason, I don't know that the local jurisdictions have completely focused on affordable housing in this area. It's traditionally residential. But two things I want to talk about. So one, we did create, there is a tax credit program through the state. we ended up having to cap that, I believe, 20 million a year. But if you're creating, and I think affordable housing is sort of not what people think it is. I mean, this is working people. It's they take it as a percentage of median income. This isn't, I think people often have a misconception of what it means to be affordable housing. We mean affordable for a family of four with two parents working, And so the city of Charleston has some really good programs. They recently allowed accessory dwelling units of less than 800 square feet if it's going to be a long-term lease. I just saw in the paper that they'd created something like 150 affordable housing units, which is not enough. I mean, right? So it's just a start. But they've had programs in place. Obviously this is a big debate at Charleston County right now about affordable housing and what they're going to do, the trust fund and how they can incentivize that. There is already some zoning incentives. But again, we want to see more public-private partnerships. And so, while my district may not be a shining example of it, I will commend the city and the county for their work. Maybe in a lot of areas. Now, Johns Island, I think, is an area where I knew of at least one unit that was putting in some affordable units, as a result of like a zoning density bonus. So, we want to see it, especially with the commercial economic sort of development we're seeing along, especially the Maybank corridor on Johns Island. Anytime we can have housing, again, near jobs so that we're reducing that traffic congestion. You don't ever want to have all your houses in one place and all your jobs in another, such that all the traffic is going in one direction, right? You want to make use of all your roads. That's I think in a planned community, you have the luxury of sort of mixing work and residential units, and so Charleston obviously has been so historic that we haven't grown up in that way. But
isn't the key, though, State Representative, rent control for this issue?
It can be. I think it can be everything from there has to be there has to be a carrot in order to demand the stick, right? And so you have to give something that they wouldn't ordinarily get in order to demand the rent control, right? So that's where that accessory dwelling unit comes from. That's where these density bonuses come from. In fact, there are the city of Charleston has had an affordable housing program in place for a while, and they've always given you more lot coverage and more ability to build in exchange for rent controlled units at, I believe it's 80% of the median income, although I haven't checked recently. The town of James Island also has density options for, they typically only allow 3 houses per acre, but if you're building affordable housing within 80% of the median income, it's 4 units, right? So you have to give something in order to demand. You couldn't just tell a private owner, again, who had never taken government money or had any government, anything like that, and you couldn't just say, well, now you have to control the rents. You have to it has to be a carrot and a stick, in my opinion.
So where is there more to build, especially in your district?
Well, you're right. There's not a lot of land. A lot of what I represent is rural Johns Island. And I've long been an advocate for maintaining the urban growth boundary. That's something that we've got to maintain rural character, urban character, suburban character, right? And again, it's not like we are creating a ton of jobs in that area. And so I think, that's something that from back in the 80s, the master plan for this region has always included that urban growth boundary. And that's because we haven't invested the infrastructure and the roads and we don't have the infrastructures to support heavy development out there. But that is still one area that is fairly rural. We're seeing a lot of housing units go up still in Johns Island, just outside my district. So what I'll call Upper Johns Island, closer, towards River Road and over towards West Ashley. That's where we're seeing obviously a ton of growth. But you're right. A lot of District 115, which tends to border the water, is fairly developed. So what we see is really redevelopment. At this point, I think that accessory dwelling unit program is one that I'm really excited about, because that's really our only opportunity to provide more housing units is if we're doing them, 800 square feet, you're able to provide maybe a 1-bedroom, kitchen, bathroom sort of situation for a young working couple or person, or, maybe even a young mom and kids or something. So that's, I think, probably where the only opportunities are here on on the island, so to speak.
And State Representative, hypothetically, if if the urban growth boundaries, that is, are actually expanded, how do you then protect the non-urban lands?
That's the problem. I mean, there's zoning, but that urban growth boundary has been it's really not codified right now. It's just it's a memorandum of understanding between the city and the county. And so, what I'd love to see is both of those local governments, codify that into their ordinances. Right now, it is still reflected in their plans, and it is still reflected. But I'd really like to see that more firmly enshrined because. We've told the folks in Charleston County for the last 40 years that they could count on that being a rural area, and I think we've got to stay good to stay true to our word on that.
So let me ask you, where exactly can you expand the urban growth boundary right now? I know.
Well, there's and you're right. A lot of the only real the reason we're seeing the growth go up I-26 is because that's sort of out, the urban growth bound that is considered, or at least the part in Charleston County. I couldn't speak for Berkeley or Dorchester, I'm not as familiar, but that is all within the urban growth boundary that was set in place, and so that's why you see a lot of that growth. We're seeing more and more housing coming in as you go up I-26. Now, remember I talked about earlier that you want from a land use and master planning sort of perspective, you don't want all the traffic going one direction. So I'm delighted to see. From some of it's the Department of Commerce, but some of it's just private investments and Dorchester and Berkeley County doing such a great job with tax incentives that we are seeing a lot of economic development in that area. It started with, back with Boeing, but then Volvo coming in, all the suppliers that go to that. You've got Google up there now. We've got the new Walmart distribution center in Ridgeville. So as we see economic development march up 26 and you get closer and closer to, rural areas that really need these good jobs. Now somebody from Calhoun County might be able to drive down to Ridgeville and, have a good job. And so, for every Boeing or Scout or whatever that comes in, Volvo, you get tons and tons of suppliers from there. And so I do think that hopefully that gives an opportunity for people that, live in, had to live sort of, what they would consider sort of outside of town for a reasonable house and home price. Maybe that gives people an opportunity to have really good jobs that they don't have to sit in an hour with the traffic for.
So what is the typical house price right now in your district?
It's unbelievable. Did you know that in Charleston County, it's $550,000 of the median home price? Isn't that unbelievable? That's to purchase a home. So yeah, it's really, and that's why, we talk about teachers and we talk about the need for teacher pay in Charleston County. That's what we're talking about to try to buy a home here. And so, it's definitely the pressure is intense. The real estate market has really made it difficult for just, everyday working people to be able to live where they work.
Now, going back to the urban growth boundary, State Representative, let me ask you, has that actually caused the rents and home prices in your district to go up?
Well, and that's always the question, right? That's always the balancing act, is how do you protect rural character, right? Obviously, supply and demand dictates that the more houses you have, the more price, we haven't really seen that play out, even with all, what we're seeing on Johns Island, for example, right now, are a lot more housing units being built, but prices actually still continuing to go up, right? So, unfortunately, Charleston is just so in demand right now that there's just almost unlimited demand, seemingly. And so, if we saw supply and demand working in the way, and I don't mean to question modern economics or anything like that. I'm sure it is working in the way the market would dictate. It's just demand is so high that supply is just not, to say that this one small urban or rural area is going to greatly impact the supply. What we really need to be talking about are, centering our mass transit around sort of what we plan for as density hubs. Again, along these regional commercial corridors, not necessarily in our rural areas on Hollywood. You'll see some growth out there, but it's probably, Johns Island. It's more likely to be single family, larger lots, more typical rural development. What I'm talking about in terms of affordable housing needs to be closer to economic centers, needs to be closer to mass transit. And so, yes, it's, you're correct in terms of the urban growth boundary. You're not creating affordable housing in that area. But I also don't know that I think that we have lower hanging fruit that doesn't upset the balance. Again, trying to protect the character here that makes Charleston is always a balancing act. So in my mind, it's not all in one direction or all in the other.
So how many homes in your district have actually been built at a fairly consistent rate?
Oh my gosh. Like I said, a lot of the growth is just outside my district over in what's now Representative Lieber's district. Even Representative Stavronakis' district, all that area, West Ashley, Johns Island, is actually just outside my district. But I don't know the answer in terms of how many homes, but I do know that we're seeing them go up, as fast as we can.
And how many homes do you think will be continued to be built at a fairly consistent rate in the next 5 years?
I don't know. So each House district, so 10 years ago we had, our maps were drawn for political, it's called redistricting. And I know you know that, but just for anyone listening that doesn't follow all as closely as we do, with the last redistricting, I think our districts were 36 or 37,000, and now they're 41 or 42,000. So you figure over 10 years, we added, just to each district, we added, I don't know, whatever that math is, six or 7,000, depending on where we started, where we ended. So, we added 6 or 7,000 voting. So that's voting population, meaning 18 and older. Right. There are probably some children there too.
Sure.
So, statewide, I think we're adding hundreds of thousands of people over a 10-year period. But tons of growth. The key though is, can we get the jobs and the growth into the areas that need it, that are, like I said, sort of, right. Can we put jobs where we have land to build housing? How can we sort of even that out rather than trying to cram everything into a peninsula bordered on all sides by water?
Yeah, I'm sitting on the peninsula right now as we speak. But let me ask you then, so where exactly could you put jobs right now, ideally, in your district?
Mm-hmm. Again, my district is not a commercial center. Right. It's really not. Right. What we see in my district, the number one industry down here is tourism. And sure. So what we see are a lot of secondary jobs created by things like rental houses. So a lot of the jobs are not necessarily in a fixed commercial location. It's things like, property managers or housekeepers or, everything from, all the sort of secondary jobs that get created when you have a tourism industry. So hospitality workers, food and beverage, hotel services, tour guides, all these sort of secondary type industries that come, a lot of which don't necessarily have a physical office location, like you think of like a manufacturing job or things like that. So I think that's probably where the growth is and will continue to be in my district is, we have a real focus on tourism, hospitality. Again, I know I mentioned this earlier, but, this is a fairly high income district. And so you see probably a lot of, professors and business owners and things like that. So it's a really varied, and in fact, in a lot of our beach communities, I know this bears out in the census, but we have a large retired population as well. So probably not the booming commercial center of South Carolina, but a beautiful place to be.
Yes, indeed. And, speaking of retirees, a lot of, educators are now retirees as well. And I want to go back to January, that is, because obviously, the GOP, senators advanced the private school bill, which was their first priority in the 2023 legislative session. Legislation provided parents $6,000 towards the private K-12 tuition, which was their first priority. The GOP dominated South Carolina Senate as Republicans who fought for private school choice for 2 decades intend to get their voucher program across the finish line this year. So, in your opinion, State Representative, how much of a blow was this to public education?
Well, I've always opposed vouchers. I think we have to acknowledge that no matter how many vouchers and school choice opportunities we create, 80 to 90% of our South Carolina students are still going to be educated in our public school system. Our public school system is still going to set the standard for our economy, for our job creation. I mean, the reality is public school is still going to be the bedrock of how we educate public school, or how we educate South Carolina children. It is still our future, and defunding it is not the answer. Right? So, if people have concerns about the schools, they need to work with them. This like laughable idea that we can't keep throwing money at schools. I mean, we're not throwing money at schools. We've chronically underfunded our government for decades. And so, this idea that, we can't keep throwing money at them. Well, we're in the bottom half of funding for education, and education outcomes are often tied to funding. Now, is there room for improvement? Of course, but let's get in and roll up our sleeves and do the work, rather than just admitting defeat and offering a lifeboat for some kids who can afford public school and transportation to get off the island. What does that say about all the kids we're leaving in the public school system?
So how many kids in your district have actually left the public school system?
Oh, I don't know. I don't know the answer. I don't know. We don't really track. If they never came into the public school system, we don't really track whether they left. Now, we do see transfer numbers, in the D3 district. I don't know those answers off the top of my head, but I would guess that there's a pretty high percentage of people in my district that don't use the public school system. Now, listen, there's nothing wrong with private school. If you want to send your child to a religious school, maybe you're Catholic, faith-based school, or you want to send your child for sports reasons to some, that's great. I'm not criticizing that. What I'm saying is, I have no problem with somebody using private money to do private school, just like we talked about with, accountability and transparency in businesses. It's when you start using public money that I have an issue.
Yes, ma'am. So you mentioned earlier about the defunding the money. So what is the Democrats' answer to that?
I think we've got to keep working on our schools. Right now, we're talking about teacher pay, getting it up to, something like 42,000 was last year, and we talked about adding another 2,500. So in Charleston County, $45,000 a year certainly doesn't buy you a house. It doesn't attract teachers. It doesn't, we're having, we see in the news every day more and more parents coming in and, going through book by book on a teacher's bookshelf to make sure there's no objectionable books. And, it's just, we're not making it better. We're not investing in these public schools the way we should be. So, my belief, and I've co-sponsored bills to this extent, and I'm really proud to say just last week the House passed, a big bill that would be a big deal for educators, helping them, helping teachers with their contracts, helping them with professional time, and making really, really a game-changing bill for teachers. And those are the kinds of investments and changes we have to make. And we, right now the House budget, I know the Senate is still working on these numbers, but at the last time when it left the House, we had added $2,500 a year for teachers. So these are the kinds of investments and changes we have to make if we want our public schools to succeed. And I am proud to say that we are slowly moving forward, but we can't stop this momentum. We've really, really got to. Obviously COVID was a huge blow. We were just on the cusp of making some progress. I'm also a believer in partnerships with nonprofits in our school district. We have some excellent, amazing nonprofits that come in and partner with our school districts. In the PD, we have the PACE Center for Girls. We have Communities in Schools. We have some amazing organizations that partner with students who need, who've had adverse childhood experiences, or who need wraparound services, or even just we just approved the ability for nonprofits to come in and do vision screening in schools and provide glasses to children who need them. So I recognize that the government cannot provide every service. We have to be able to partner with nonprofits, but I do believe they have to be not-for-profits, not businesses. Because once you start bringing a profit motive into the education system, I think that really leaves it open for abuse or discrimination. That's part of the issue with the vouchers, is that these schools are not required to accommodate disabilities in the same way our public schools are. And so they can pick and choose what students are there and how that reflects their test scores. And I just don't know that we should be using our public funds for, anything of the sort.
So whatever happened to the separation of church and state?
I think that is a long argument that I don't know that we have time for here today, but suffice to say that I do believe that is still an important tenet. I know that There are a lot of people who've spent a lot of time and effort studying to indicate that they're, maybe it's a complex and nuanced issue for sure. But I do tend to agree that we can't, when we're using public money and we're requiring certain religious beliefs or, not accommodating disabilities, I just don't know that that's appropriate for our state to be doing. But you'll see my vote, and I think, unfortunately, I think what we know, as you mentioned, this is a priority, and I think we are likely to see it pass. So the only, and you asked originally, your question was how much of a blow to the public education system is this? I will say that the House proposal initially, and I'll be curious to see how this plays out, it was a different pot of money. Now, I would argue that pot should go to public education, but at the very least, it didn't use it's not like it actually directly took funding from education. So I will give credit to the House budget writers last year. When their initial voucher proposal came out, it was using other money. Now, my argument would be all the public funds should be used to fund our priorities, which should be public education. But, to the budget writers' credit, there was some effort to identify other revenue sources for the vouchers.
So how much public funds are going to private schools now?
Well, we have we currently have, and have for many years had, funding available for, it's income-based funding for students with extreme disabilities. And so we already have that in place. We also allow some 4K programs to set up. So there's no direct funding going to private schools, but we do have some programs that allow. I know the severely disabled children are eligible to participate in a trust fund type program. So that's currently what we have in place, but this would of course expand it if assuming it passes.
And in 20 seconds, what other funding sources have you all been able to identify thus far?
You mean have they used for the vouchers? Well, so if we take up the Senate bill, it will come out of general revenues. So that was my nod to the House, but okay. The Senate bill actually is not as discerning, is my understanding. So I'll have to double check the numbers, but my understanding is it would come out of general revenues on that piece of it. So if we take up the Senate's bill.
And is it the state going to do a study and report how private schools are actually using that funding?
We'll be pushing for it.
State Representative Spencer Wetmore, thank you for your time. And again, welcome back to Quintin's Close-Ups.
Thank you so much for having me. Always a pleasure. I'll talk to you soon.
Likewise.